Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Requirements Project Overview and Update. My name is Tony Breeds. I'm a Principal Software Engineer at Red Hat and former PTL of the project. What does Requirements do? Well, we manage OpenStack-wide requirements and we coordinate and converge the libraries and ensure that they are compatible both technically and from a licensing point of view. Our project started shortly after the Austin Summit in 2016 when we separated out from the release team because there was more work to do for requirements than one team could handle. For the Stein release, we had 49 contributors, excluding the bot, which was way more than all 49 of them put together. We have 4 active core reviewers, and we're used by pretty much everybody in OpenStack, sometimes a little bit unwillingly. For Stein, we didn't achieve a great deal, but one of the good things we did do was publishing of static constraints with static URLs. So you can see the old URL for Rocky and the new URL. The reason this is helpful is when the Rocky branch disappeared out of Git, you lost access to the constraints, which means that projects that have that in their tox.ini file essentially prevent us from end-of-lifing old branches in the requirements repo. So with the new static URLs, that's not a problem, and it also has the awesome benefit when we're switching branches at release time. We can actually create they exist now. The train constraints exist now. So people who want to can start pinning to train, and then when we actually release train, they don't have to do anything, and it's all magic. So that's kind of cool. The work is mostly complete. We're using the URLs on the Stein branch only, but there's a little bit more work to do. Also, continuing work for train, we have declared lower constraints complete in Queens and Rocky and Stein. It's not quite there yet. The infrastructure is all there, but we found a number of projects that aren't using them correctly. In your tox.ini, we see a lot of people doing this, and people not familiar with pip and tox and all that sort of stuff. What ends up happening is when you try to enable the test env, the lower constraints test env, you end up specifying 2 constraints files, both the upper constraints and the lower constraints, and pip picks the first one. So you're always going to be running your lower constraints environment with upper constraints, and wonder why it passes just as often as it does on the upper constraints test. So the right way to do this is to move the constraints out of the install command into the dependencies. Now this is not hard, it's pretty easy to understand. We just failed to notice the projects hadn't done that correctly. So there's going to be a little bit of busy work to try and get everybody in shape. And that probably means that people who currently think they're passing with lower constraints are going to have a small amount of work. There was one project we did a while ago where we fixed up the tox environment and then think we had to change the lower constraints for about 7 to 10 libraries because they were suddenly testing the lower constraints. We're going to try and get that done early this cycle so that it's in place properly when we release train, because it's not going to be backportable to anything. Things we're going to do in train for sure. We're going to remove projects.txt. That used to be like the canonical list of which projects were using the requirements repo, which projects were co-installable, which ones were managed. Now it's basically just a text file because we've pushed everything out into the repos. It doesn't offer a great deal of value. It's unmaintained, it's unmaintainable because we've broken all of our tooling, and there's a lack of, actually the effort to fix the tooling is better spent getting the current consumers off of projects.txt. So that's something we're going to do probably in the middle of the cycle, I would guess. Finishing the static constraints URLs. Stable branches are really easy. The files exist, they're non-controversial. We just need to basically run a really big sed over the entire OpenStack code base for every branch. So yay, stats. Master is a little bit harder because we've got a couple of options there that we need to discuss in the community. The first one is we stick with what we're doing at the moment, where master points at the master URL, which is always going to stay there. And when we release, the release team will switch. When you do your RC1, we'll switch you from master to the appropriate release branch and everything will be happy, which is basically what we do at the moment. The other option, which I think is kind of cute, but we'll see whether everybody else agrees with me, is at branch time, we actually pin everybody to the release name at that point. So shortly, in theory, we could have everybody pinned to the train constraints. And then when we release train, we pin everybody to the unicorn constraints. Unicorn name unconfirmed. This is kind of cute because it allows us to fix another issue that's unrelated to constraints that distributors have, where for a short window of time, the semver for the master branch is actually lower than the semver on the stable branch. So packaging has to put some hacks into place to correctly uprev the semver on the master branch. If we created this patch, we could add the semver major bump in the commit message, and that problem would go away. So that's kind of why I like this idea. But at the moment, it's kind of all up here and not in the keyboard. Nobody else has really heard it apart from you guys. The next one is quite important. Supporting constraints for multiple minor versions of Python 3 is not quite right. For example, Python 3 for certain constraint, Python 3.7 for certain constraints is currently unconstrained. So that's a bit of a bug, considering we're testing Python 3.7 in a lot of places. So we need to revisit the way we generate constraints for Python 3. Python 2.7 is less of an issue. And just do it right. There's a couple of options there. We could use some of the new hotness in Zool to generate containers, and yeah, there's a lot of fun work to happen there. The other thing that has been a bit of a problem for the requirements repo is OpenStack projects that consume service projects. For example, Neutron, Horizon, Ceilometer. We had a session about that on Monday, sorry. I'm not in control of the schedule. Turns out, after thinking about it quite deeply with some very smart people, we can just treat them like libraries. We have to do some extra gating. It puts a small amount of extra process for those service projects, but not others. But we're pretty sure we can get that working and remove a lot of the problems the requirement sees with this codependencies. Possible new features for train and beyond. Now that we've got per project unit tests working with lower constraints, it'd be really cool to be able to do functional testing with lower constraints to give us a little bit more confidence, and ideally integrated testing with lower constraints, because there's a number of distros out there that, for reasons that make sense to their business, and I'm not criticizing those reasons, choose to remain very static in their libraries that they ship. And they are much closer to lower than they are to upper in a lot of cases. So if we can do a small amount of work to enable their confidence, then maybe that's a good thing. The next one is really important. It's education. We've had a lot of churn in the requirements repo and our processes specifically. We've moved a lot of work out to the project teams. We've created some tooling to make sure that's done correctly, but we haven't really done any true education about how to use those tools, how to go about debugging things when those tools fail, and all that sort of stuff. So the first thing we need to do is a thorough assessment of what documentation exists, what the shortfalls are, and then fix that. And the other thing that's kind of near and dear to my heart is the stable policy. We've got a number of rules in the requirements repo about what you can and can't do on stable branches. They're a little bit more restrictive than other code-based repos. Those were mostly put in place a long time ago to aid vendors and distributors from certain amounts of pain, but we're not seeing vendors actually benefit from those changes. So maybe our stable policy for requirements is wrong. So during train and beyond, I'd like to sit down with vendors and distributors and see whether our policy is correct, and if not, whether we should change it. Last but not least, you should come join us. We have Tim Tams literally in my bag. Come join us. You can obviously get the code from OpenDev, find us on requirements, or ping us on the mailing list with the requirements tag. Thank you. Any questions? You got a question? No? All right. Cool beans.